Okay, it's time to talk about potassium. A little bit of a nerd joke in there. If you know your elementary table, elements table, K is obviously the symbol for potassium. And potassium is an often overlooked micronutrient that actually plays a vital role to not only our overall health and fitness, but definitely to our athletic performance as well. So, a recent study conducted in 2021 confirms that what similar bodies of work have already kind of discovered, and what they suggest is that dietary sodium to potassium ratio is more strongly associated with increased risk of hypertension and cardiovascular disease related mortality. It's a bit of a mouthful. All right, let me just simplify that. Basically, your risk of heart disease and related factors, right? And basically, it's not so much, because we've been long told that you've got to watch your salt, it's bad for your heart and all that sort of stuff. And the reality is that's not quite the case. The reality is that your ratio of sodium to potassium is going to play a far more significant role in your risk in those sort of factors. And for reference, the ideal ratio is roughly 1 to 3 in favor of potassium. So, for every milligram of sodium, you have, 3 milligrams of potassium. And because of the way that our modern diets are, most people tend to eat more salt than potassium and are potentially under eating potassium as well. So to give you an idea, I think roughly the average person needs about 4,700 milligrams of potassium, and on average we need between probably 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of salt, right? So anyway, back to this study. Scientists followed over 2,000 people aged between sort of 30 and 64 and tracked their eating and health data over 12 years, which is, quite a significant study, right? And when the study started, none of the candidates had cardiovascular disease. What they found is the more potassium people ate, the lower their risk of cardiovascular disease, which is a very interesting find. And then specifically, the risk was elevated at potassium intakes of less than 25,000 milligrams, but began to drop once people were eating more than that. So, as I mentioned before, the recommended intake is somewhere around about 4,700. But it seems like you can get away with eating around about 3,000 milligrams and still getting some health benefits. A similar trend was seen with magnesium intakes. Now, magnesium, you'll see, is quite widely talked about, and we usually talk about it in terms of muscle recovery and those sorts of things as well. And obviously, if you're drinking a lot of alcohol, it's recommended that you replace, your magnesium levels. Anyway, moving back to this, for magnesium, the risk was higher intakes of less than 240 milligrams, and lower for those consuming greater amounts. So I think the recommended dose for magnesium off the top of my head is around about 400 milligrams to 800 milligrams on average per person, right? What's really interesting is that no trend was actually seen with sodium intake. So eating more or less salt didn't really have an effect on your risk of cardiovascular problems over the 12-year period. And no trend was seen for calcium either. So it's interesting. So what does this mean? Well, there's probably 3 practical applications that I can think of. And the first one is to focus on adding rather than subtracting to your daily diet. So, diet culture is often about telling people what they shouldn't eat. And, I think that's one, we don't want to have that. You shouldn't eat this, or you can't eat that, because then that doesn't actually help us move forward to eating the things that we should have. So it would seem that, if heart health is a concern of yours, you could almost simply eat more potassium and magnesium rich foods, which is fortunate because that pretty much basically means eating more fruit, vegetables, starchy tubers and healthy fats, right? And there's really no downsides because the best sources are whole, minimally processed foods. And when we tend to eat them, they, tend to curb things like our chocolate cravings and things like that. So sometimes when we crave chocolate, it's not just the sugar sweet hit that we're getting. It's actually because we're potentially deficient in magnesium as well. So whilst this study suggests that sodium isn't, and number two, sorry, is watching your sodium is a discussion between you and a medical practitioner, right? It's certainly out of the scope of my practice to suggest that you shouldn't worry about salt. And whilst this study suggests that salt isn't relevant to cardiovascular health, in other scenarios it might mean a whole lot. So for example, some people are salt sensitive, a condition that does in fact cause sodium intake to increase a person's risk of high blood pressure or hypertension and cardiovascular disease. Interesting as well, right? Like, it depends on what you're doing as well, right? Like marathon runners, for example, are probably going to need more salt and things like that as well, because they're going to be depleting that quite rapidly. And anyone who does a lot of heavy physical labor or is an athlete are going to deplete things like sodium, magnesium, and potassium quite more regularly because they're sweating it out. And also, salt is our main energy conductor. So if we want to convert our food into, there's a lot more other processes in there, but if we were to break it down into like very rudimentary part, right? Like we need salt to be able to convert our food into energy and get the energy that we need to actually contract our muscles and actually move our bodies, right? So anyway, moving back to the study, and back to my point around, sodium being intake being a discussion with you and the doctor. I guess, the caveat being is that even if there are, large population studies that show that the sodium-potassium ratio is more important for measuring your cardiovascular health, there's always exceptions on an individual level, right? And that's why I always encourage people to, develop their own, what we call an owner's manual. So, getting data from your doctor and keeping that on file, right? So that you can measure the trends around what your biofactors are, your mineral levels and all that sort of stuff, and watch trends over time in terms of whether you're deficient over things, right? And then look at what you're doing in terms of your lifestyle habits and make the necessary adjustments in accordance with medical guidance. What's an interesting fact as well is that, as I mentioned before, modern diets mean that, a lot of ultra-processed foods are often loaded with sodium. One, because it's a quick flavour hit, so a lot of people don't realise, for example, soft drinks not only contain a lot of sugar, but they actually contain a lot of sodium. A lot of salt is obviously a good preservative, and then there's a lot of things where that combination of salt and sugar makes something hyper palatable, because you get this, like, basically an assault on your palate with very easy, simple flavours that then, give that illusion of having a much more enhanced flavour profile than what's actually there. So as a result of reducing sodium intake, if you choose minimally processed foods, then you're probably going to improve your diet overall, including reducing your sodium intake if that's something that's a concern for you. And number three, eating more potassium and magnesium-rich foods can help crowd out ultra-processed foods, because the best sources of potassium and magnesium obviously come from those fruit, vegetables and tubers and stuff. And when we eat them, they're a lot more nutrient dense, they're a lot more filling. And so what we can find is that when we get those things, it tends to stop those cravings, and it also creates less room. And we're less likely to snack and things like that as well, right? So the result obviously is that we increase our potassium and our magnesium intake, reduce our sodium, and so really it's a win-win situation, or a win-win-win situation if you want to get technical. And this is one of the reasons, right, when even with my nutrition for athletes, and particularly in off-season, there's a focus on getting a wide variety of nutrient-dense, minimally processed foods, because I'm of the view that you need to be exposing your body to a wide variety of nutrients, and basically replenishing your stores, right, ahead of an on-season where you might have calorie restrictions or a much more narrow diet to focus on a particular goal. And it's why I recommend whole foods like potatoes and avocados, and I'll go into that a little bit later in another live where I talk about why I use high GI carbohydrates, particularly for sports nutrition. There's a particular reason for that, but that's another conversation for another day. Anyway, back to my earlier point, when we've got athletes, for example, that are on short phases of restriction, consideration to potassium, magnesium, and sodium intake becomes particularly important, and it can do as well with when we're managing also water balance as well, because for example, we don't want people cramping, and we want people to be able to contract their muscles fully, and we want them to be able to do that despite being in a deficit and potentially in extreme phases of a sport, say for example bodybuilding. So it's not unusual to supplement with a little bit of potassium and magnesium leading into a competition, for example. And as I said before, athletes or workers in heavy industries tend to deplete in certain minerals faster than others due to the nature of their training, energy, expenditure, and exposure to weather extremes. So FIFO workers, for example, it's not uncommon for them to need to supplement a little bit with hydrolytes and things like that because they're drinking a lot more water. They're also working in harsh conditions and they're sweating a lot more. So it's really important that we actually pay a little bit more attention to what's going on in terms of ensuring that they've got adequate potassium and magnesium through their diet to set them up for success. And obviously adequate nutrition optimizes performance. And what are we trying to do with athletes? We're trying to optimize their performance, right? And so I guess my next point is as well, like if you've been stepping your exercise up and you're struggling to unlock that next level of performance, you're finding yourself not recovering as much, you're a bit fatigued, not getting as much out of your performance that you'd like, and you think nutrition might be the missing key, then make sure you book in a chat with me so that I can talk you through how you might help yourself reach the next level, or how I might be able to help you. All right, let me know if you found any of that useful and insightful, and comment below and I'll comment back. Thanks a lot.